Once upon a time not long ago, a group of elusive, unnamed musicians sent a demo to Warner Brothers Records simply titled the Warner Brothers album. The label of course didn't care for it because it sounded too much like an elementary school music class, so they sent them a letter of rejection, but since the group didn't have a name, it was simply addressed to residents. And lo and behold, this happened. The band would keep their identities concealed throughout their entire career, eventually settling on the now iconic eyeball head and suit getup that's probably more recognizable than the actual music. Now, unlike other bands from the 70s who wore big outfits on stage as a product of the glam rock era, constantly trying to one-up each other in terms of looks rather than focusing on actual songwriting, the residents concealed their identities as part of the belief in the theory of obscurity. This theory states that art is at its most pure when it isn't influenced by anything else from the outside world, which is much easier to do when you're obscure and don't have a legion of fans who are constantly demanding you what to do next. Because nobody knew who the residents were as individuals, they saw it as an opportunity to be as weird and challenging as possible, regardless of what anybody thinks about them. Now, the actual identities of the main forces behind the band have been readily available for a while, and while I would like to ignore that for the sake of keeping the magic of the band alive, I want to say rest in peace Hardy Fox. Throughout their nearly 50-year career, they've remained consistently prolific, releasing not only like 70-something albums, but always being at the forefront of modern technology, like being the first band to have their own CD-ROM games, and releasing DVDs with surreal visuals to go along with their music. While the visual aspect is a big part of what they do as an art collective, they are a band at the end of the day, so what exactly is their music like? Well, that kind of depends on what album you're listening to, but one thing they all have in common is how terrifying they are. Their debut album, Meet the Residents, established both their deceivingly amateurish sounding but strangely catchy approach to composition, and a tongue-in-cheek attitude towards popular music. I mean, is this cover art ring any bells for you? These key elements would play a big role in their early discography, like the Third Reich and Roll, which satirically points out similarities between the music industry and the Third Reich by covering pop songs in the most disturbing way imaginable. Fingerprints, which has the extended track Six Things to a Cycle that's pretty much what a ballet would sound like if all the instruments were made by Fisher-Price. And Eskimo. You know what? I'm not even gonna go there. The real outlier of the Residents' music from this era is Not Available, an album that they had recorded back in 1974, but planned on not releasing until all the members had forgotten about it, as a way to exercise the theory of obscurity to its fullest. I'd like to make an entire video about this album sometime, so that's all I'm gonna say about it for now. Even though their earlier records are their most talked about, like many other bands who've lasted this long, albums like Freak Show, Wormwood, and Animal Lover prove just how long they've been able to keep on reinventing themselves and maintain refreshing ideas from record to record. And what, you didn't think these guys had an Elvis covers album? With such a vast discography of strange and otherworldly music, where does one even begin to get into this band? Well, in 1978, the group released a 7-track EP titled Duck Stab, which had something none of their other albums had. Sales! The first issue of this thing sold out way quicker than any of their other records did, which makes sense seeing as how their past few albums gave them some notoriety for being as left field as they were, and since it was just an EP, that meant people could see what all the hubbub was about without having to pay the price for an entire album. On top of that, the music on this thing is more accessible than their other albums, but I'll get to that in a bit. The group not only wanted to capitalize on the success of this EP, but make it sound a little bit better too, as it was 16 minutes of music being pressed onto a single 7-inch record, which meant it didn't sound all that good, and not in an intentional way. They had been sitting on another EP that they'd recorded titled Buster and Glenn, and so to avoid sound quality issues on both EPs, they released Duck Stab / Buster and Glenn, which had each respective EP taking up its own side of the record. This version has since been reissued several times as just Duck Stab, and that's usually what fans refer to it as too, so that's what I'll be calling it for the rest of this video. Also, the order of the tracklist on the original Duck Stab EP is in a slightly different order than the one on the album, probably for spacing reasons, so just to be clear, I'm only going to be focusing on the album's track list. I mean, this isn't essential EPs, although that might make a good series. Well, I'm not sure if Duck Stab is the most accessible album in the band's catalog, seeing as how what's accessible is subjective, and this thing does still get pretty weird. I can't say it's probably the most conventional album that they released in the 70s. Every track is fairly short, with the longest only being 3.5 minutes, and rather than all flowing together into one piece, they all start and end like normal songs do. In fact, most of them go by a typical verse-chorus structure, which was a first for the band. However, anything that you could call conventional about this record starts and ends there, which becomes apparent within the first 20 seconds. Constantinople is one of the most eye-widening and in-your-face opening tracks of the 70s, immediately kicking off the record with these distorted yet accented brass hits that get complemented by tambourines and a weird synth arpeggio to form a catchy yet unsettling groove. It quickly gets bombarded by vocals that, despite being kind of shouty, are still easy to sing along to, and is further emphasized by this shrill keyboard part that it harmonizes with. The cacophony gets amplified on the second half of the track with these reverbed backup vocals vocals that give it a lot more depth, and we're still only 1 minute into this record. The song has gone on to be one of the group's most popular and defining tracks, and rightfully so, as it's a carefully crafted piece of experimental fun that's as disturbing as it is catchy. Primus actually covered it as a bonus track on the remaster of Frizzle Fry, alongside Hello Skinny, but we'll get to that song in a bit. After the chaos and adrenaline of the opener, the record actually calms down a bit on Sinister Exaggerator, offering this minimal rhythm that slowly plays out into this mysterious and enticing lead that's almost psychedelic in the way each note bleeds into one another. The vocals, despite being more melodic and performed in a regular tone of voice, are still made to sound borderline inhuman in context of the track, and wouldn't you know it, Primus covered this one too. Now, already from these two opening tracks, it's pretty obvious that this record is much hookier and to the point than its predecessors, but is still entirely a Residents album. Combined with lyrics that you can actually make out without having to look them up, although you might want to pull them up anyway to try to figure out what they mean, it feels more like a deconstruction of pop music than their other albums, even the commercial one. It takes pop structures, or at least some element of pop in most of the songs, and filters them through such an absurd and freakish lens that it's more forward-thinking than outright satirical. I like to connect this to the album title as well, with the duck representing pop normality, and it being stabbed or tampered with to the point where it's no longer what it once was, but is still intact to some degree. That might be a stretch, but I can't find anyone affiliated with the band ever commenting on how exactly they came up with the album title, so if any of you know, then please leave a comment. This theme of regularly structured songs created by unconventional means is well exemplified on the track Blue Rosebuds, having a sing-songy hook that bookends the track as a love song, but has a verse in the middle that completely transforms it. From its opening moments, the chorus is very straightforward and easy to understand, but the minimal vibe of the music still doesn't make it sound like your typical love song. This becomes even more apparent in the verse, as the woman, who the narrator is supposedly talking to, responds to him with rejection in the most verbosely savage way imaginable.
After eating Eskimo would gag upon your sight, convulsed into oblivion from laughter or from fright.
Damn, you could have just said no. I like to look at this as a satirical take on both songs that have lyrics that many misinterpret and listeners who don't read deeper into them. Also, those vocals are some of the weirdest on the album, and I absolutely love them. The two final songs on side A make references to historical music figures in a joking way that the group is known to do. Bach is Dead is a deep and complex analysis of innovation itself and letting go of the past in not just music, but life in general. At least that's what I think these lyrics mean. There is a short little verse at the end of the song that gives it a little more context and makes the track less one-sided, but regardless, I can't say it didn't get a good chuckle out of me my first few times hearing it. That just leaves Elvis and His Boss, which I see as a commentary on fame and how directly it correlates with an early death like Elvis's. Despite the lyrics only being confined to one verse, the vocals are almost performed like a rockabilly song, vaguely reminding me of That's Alright, even down to some of the lyrics. The track is also full of groovier instrumentation that evokes the likes of rock and roll, but because it's a Residents song, say goodbye to guitars and hello to... Flipping over to side B, Buster and Glenn has an overall similar sound to the first half in its song structuring and instrumental palette, but feels less like a self-aware commentary and more of an unrestricted exercise in songwriting. From here on out, the song topics, vocal performances, and instrumentation are even stranger than they were on side A, making for a more aggressive and abstract experience. That being said, it feels more like a continuation of the record than a whole new EP, mostly because of the aforementioned similarities, but partially because the first song, Lizard Lady, starts a little too abruptly to truly feel like the opener to a new project. This isn't really a complaint though, as I feel these two EPs were likely always meant to come together and are packaged as such nowadays, but I felt it was worth noting nonetheless. That aside, it's still a pretty great song with a bass-heavy instrumental that's mostly carried by these eerie synth quintuplets that fit the song's lyrics about a lady being kidnapped by a lizard. Yeah, we're just getting started, folks. Semolina is one of the album's true bangers with these subtle yet hypnotic bass drums that go really well with the smooth melody. It also has one of the catchiest choruses of any Residents song, which I guess considering most of their repertoire isn't saying that much, but regardless, it's still one of my favorites. Another truly out there track on this record is Birthday Boy, which is about a person who wants to be left alone on their birthday, but nobody will comply. This is communicated in not just the lyrics, but in the instrumental, which feels like it was made to sound as obnoxious as possible with these leads that sound like they're coming out of those party noisemaker things and warping synths that lay underneath them. But it wouldn't be a song about birthdays without a reference to the original 2007 song Happy Birthday to You by the Countdown Kids, so they try to incorporate it over this instrumental, and let me just say, I hope my birthday never comes again. The track ends with our protagonist happily singing the happy birthday song to himself in a way that fits slightly better over the whacked out instrumentation. I'm also willing to bet that this song was an inspiration for a Ween song of the same name, which is about coping with a breakup and eventually turns into a man singing happy birthday to himself to try and feel better. You know what? This might need an Essentials video. The album continues to get more unsettling on Weightlifting Lulu with its mysterious instrumental and grotesque lyrics, and Hello Skinny, which has gone on to be one of the band's most defining tracks. This is partially due to the music video, which I may or may not show footage of, because if I do decide to show music video footage, then you've probably been too distracted to hear a single word I've said throughout the entire video, but I'd advise you to check it out anyway. As for the meaning of the song, there's a few theories that I've come across online, like it being about a meth addict because meth makes you skinny, and the theme of constantly selling things goes along with the drug dealer lifestyle, but others have said it's just about a poor and weak person who can't afford to hold on to things. As for me, I honestly don't have a cool, unique interpretation that I can add to the table because I'm boring. What I can say though is the string part that dominates the track on top of an equally enticing bass line makes the song sound totally different from not just the rest of the album, but really most other music to come out of its era, and so does the sombering vocal performance. The group really saves us the best for last though on The Electrocutioner, taking on a more linear structure, but still keeping the song at a normal length. It acts as a perfect wrap-up to everything going on in the album, both musically and thematically, presenting the simplistic but strange approach to composition in both an aggressive and mysterious way. The track carries the staticky and outlandish sounds of the rest of the record, but is a little more varied with its guitar solos and prominent brass sections. As for the lyrics, I got nothing, but they sound cool. So overall, I think Duckstab still holds up as one of the best experimental albums of the 70s, and even though it stands entirely on its own and not much else sounds like it, it's not a record that's gonna test your patience or even force you to think all that deeply about it to enjoy it. It's a very fun record with catchy hooks, memorable melodies, and moments that are so bizarre they'll likely stick with you long after you listen. It's a perfect starting point to get into the band or even this kind of music in general, and is still an exciting listen for those more familiar. As always, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, you know the drill.
Where you see where it is, but don't know where it is. Where you see where it is.